The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Today we're joined by Joel Berkowitz. He's the professor of foreign languages and literature at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He's the author of Shakespeare on the American Yiddish Stage, and he's the co-editor of Inventing the Modern Yiddish Stage. Thank you, Joel, so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So this is a subject that I think is much more influential than people may realize. What can you tell us about the sort of context out of which the Yiddish theater arises?
Yeah, so panning out a little bit more broadly, as many, but maybe not all of your listeners know, Yiddish is the language of Eastern European Jewry. It's a language that's about 1,000 years old, actually sort of came into existence in sort of Central Europe, but as many of the Jews from the Rhineland migrated eastward, really became the lingua franca of Jews in the Russian Empire and Poland and other areas in Eastern Europe. So by modern times, pretty much all Jews in the Russian Empire and Poland spoke Yiddish as the primary language. Also, importantly, they spoke other languages, and they were often multilingual. Men had at least some rudimentary education, sometimes advanced education in Hebrew, not as a spoken language, which is not how it was used in that world, but as a language of text and prayer and some official documents. Women rarely did, but tended to be literate in Yiddish and often in other languages too, in Russian or Polish or other languages from the region. So there's a lot of linguistic and cultural contact going on, and of course that becomes important as the theater comes into existence. Judaism has a couple of proscriptions, not prescriptions, against that really limit the place of performance in traditional Jewish culture. So, like the Elizabethans, like the Greeks, there were prohibitions on women performing in public. Of course, the Elizabethans and the Greeks get around this by having men and boys perform the roles of women. That doesn't work in traditional Judaism either, because there's a commandment that a man shall not put on the clothes of a woman. So now you're kind of stuck because it's not that interesting to have theater with only male characters. It pretty much limits a lot of things. So what do you do about that? Well, there's one time of the year, the holiday of Purim, which falls in winter. It's a lunar calendar, so I can't give you a date in the Western calendar, but it falls in February or March. And it's a time it's a kind of Jewish Saturnalia, where norms are turned on their head, and it's a very festive holiday. And this was a time when amateur performances really thrived. So there were all kinds of plays that were done, often ad-libbed, kind of like medieval plays in the Christian world, sometimes written down, often written in sort of like commedia with a little bit of instruction, and then we'll see something in the text that will say, and the king enters and he says what he says. So whatever he would have said is what he said. So a lot of it was just ad-libbed. These were amateur theatricals, and they were seasonal. They would be on the holiday of Purim, and sometimes they would sort of expand and be maybe a week on either side of Purim. But that's pretty much it and then there are other forms of performance that occurred in Yiddish in medieval and early modern eras. There were various kinds of strolling troubadours and minstrels and things like that, but not a full-fledged theater in the way that we tend to think of it until modern times. That all shifts starting in the late 18th century with the Jewish Enlightenment in Europe, which is basically looking at the Enlightenment that's flourishing and saying, we need to really get on board there. We need to come into the modern era. We need to be less insular and participate more broadly in modern society. That triggers all sorts of other shifts that I could easily and have spend a semester on with my students. But in short, that starts to bring about a sea change in the way that European Jews participate in modern life. And when I say European Jews, this is the vast majority of Jews in the world at that point, if we're saying circa 1800, and the majority of them would have been in Eastern Europe, would have been Yiddish-speaking Jews, and there's some Yiddish-speaking Jews in Western Europe too. So we sort of lay the groundwork for a professional Yiddish stage, which still doesn't really come about until around the third quarter of the 19th century. And so 1876 is generally given as the year when a guy named Avram Goldfaden, starting in Romania, he's actually from the Russian Empire, but he's in the city of Yassi or Yash at that moment, and starts to stage performances that really become the beginning of the modern Yiddish theater and the beginning of the professional Yiddish theater.
And this spans a variety of cultures, a variety of continents, yes?
That's absolutely right. And there's so much more work to be done. I mean, there has been some work done on the way that Yiddish performers and the people who create theater draw from the influences of the cultures around them. But there's so much more of that to do, and there's also, by the same token, there's a lot more to be learned about the way that Yiddish theater has an effect on those cultures. It's interesting. Just in the past week, there were two obituaries of some prominent people in the performance world. One was Fivish Finkel, the character actor who, quite late in his career, when a lot of people are winding down, in his 70s, he was cast on the television show Picket Fences as a defense attorney in a small town in Wisconsin. And ends up winning an Emmy Award and sort of has a whole new career opens up for him. But he came of age in the Yiddish theater. He had been in a Yiddish theater company in Pittsburgh, of all places, for decades, actually, and had done various other things too. So we see someone whose career takes him from the world of Yiddish into the American scene. And also, just yesterday, there was an obituary for the film director Arthur Hiller, perhaps best known for Love Story. Also directed the 70s comedy The In-Laws, which is one of my favorite movies ever, I'd say. And to many of our surprise, including people who study Yiddish theater, he was in the Yiddish theater in a troupe in Canada. I think it was in Winnipeg, where he grew up. Who knew? So there are these interesting kind of traces of that in places that even people who follow this stuff closely don't know. And those are a couple little snapshots of how of the kind of contact that's happening and the way that people's lives and careers will kind of weave in and out of the world of Yiddish performance.
It's interesting that you say that last anecdote about Hiller. Really, I mean, you've built an entire career on studying this, and it sounds like in many ways, you've really only begun to scratch the surface. Such depth and complexity. I'm wondering, for someone who might not be familiar with Yiddish theater, perhaps at all, who are some of the big names, playwrights, designers, actors from that late 19th century into the early mid 20th century period?
Yeah. First of all, I'll say for the best general orientation to the subject is a book called Vagabond Stars by Nama Sandrow, Sandrow. And that's a book that was written in the 1970s, has been reissued a couple of times. She's updated a little bit, but it continues to be the single best one-volume introduction to Yiddish theater and drama, really in any language, certainly in English. So I highly recommend that for anyone who wants to get a start. Um, the playwrights, I mentioned Avram Goldfaden. Um, I did a book with Jeremy Dauber, who teaches at Columbia, of translations of 5 Yiddish plays called Landmark Yiddish Plays. And we translated a play called The Two Kuni Lemels of Goldfaden's from the early 1880s. It's a musical comedy, a kind of, well, it's a farce, with sort of elements of comedy of errors, a lot of sort of, dressing in disguise, and two characters who get confused with one another. And it was an enormous sensation. Not it premiered in Eastern Europe, but it became just a staple of the Yiddish theater. So Goldfaden is one of the, he's really he kind of named himself the father of the Yiddish theater, a little, not very modestly, but not entirely inaccurately either, at least in some ways. So he's enormously important. Jacob Gordon, Gordin, was really the person who kind of cast the largest shadow over the next era of Yiddish theater, overlapped with Goldfaden's actually, and they died within a year of each other. But Gordon was a Russian intellectual, actually came to writing Yiddish plays, and even writing in Yiddish at all, quite late, in sort of middle age, then wrote a number of very important plays. And Gordon was a great admirer of Gorky and Ibsen and Hauptmann, and so the sort of modern, naturalists, or at least sometime naturalists, who were dealing with social issues. He was quite controversial because he's taking on issues, so, not unlike someone like Ibsen, of having children out of wedlock, and of all kinds of social problems and the role of women in society. Many of those plays feel a bit dated now, but also a fair amount of power in them. Namasandro, who I just mentioned, actually has a book of translations. It's actually named after one of the plays in it. It's God, Man, and Devil, which is a Gordon play, one of his best, a kind of Faustian drama, but really quite good. And then some other interesting plays in there if people want to get a taste of those in English. And from there, most of the playwrights beyond that, there are a number of really important people, most of them not too well known out of the, a handful of us who study Yiddish drama in the original. But of the plays that are best known, I would say overwhelmingly the most famous is S. Ansky's drama, The Dybbuk, from which premiered in 1920, actually just after Ansky died, and has been translated into I don't know how many languages. There are multiple English translations and all sorts of adaptations. It's a wonderful, beautiful play, and that's many of your listeners may know it. They may have even been in it. They may have seen it. Probably the second best known Yiddish drama, if it's possible to quantify things these ways, I think would be Sholem Asch's play God of Vengeance, from around 1907. And Asch was a tremendously prolific Yiddish writer with a long career, wrote a bunch of plays early on, and actually gravitated away from the theater and became better known for the most part to Yiddish and even to English readers as a novelist. But God of Vengeance remains among his most important and influential works, and again has been adapted by multiple people. I should mention, among prominent adapters, Tony Kushner did an adaptation of The Dybbuk called A Dybbuk. Donald Margulies did an adaptation of God of Vengeance, but there are other translations around. And very recently, the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Paula Vogel did a play, not an adaptation of God of Vengeance, but a play about God of Vengeance and about Sholem Asch, called Indecent, which premiered at the Yale Rep and went to the La Jolla Playhouse and then to New York. So it's a fascinating sort of meditation on the sexual politics of God of Vengeance, because remarkably, it God of Vengeance has a very sympathetic lesbian relationship and a lesbian kiss on stage. And so Paula Vogel explores some of the ramifications of that, but also a meditation in lots of ways on Yiddish theater itself and on Yiddish culture, and other issues too. So it's really quite wonderful. In terms of stars, there are many. The first kind of generation of professional Yiddish actors yielded people like Jacob Adler, who would be perhaps best known to an English-speaking audience, particularly through his I'm sorry, not, I was going to say granddaughter, to his daughter Stella, and who of course is one of the most influential acting teachers ever in this country. But Adler was the patriarch of a large family, and most of them went into the theater. He was an enormous star in his own right, as was one of his wives. Several of his wives were stars. With Stella Adler, I'm sorry, Sarah Adler was an enormous star, and so he was part of an era of some of the great leading men, which also included Boris Tomaszewski, and Boris's wife Bessie Tomaszewski was also a huge star. They've gotten a bit of traction through another one of their family members, Michael Tilson Thomas, the great conductor, who's done a lot of work actually on his grandparents and their legacy, and has a project that's been staged and filmed that explores that and the music of the world that they were in. Paul Muni is someone who had a bigger English language career than a Yiddish language one. His parents were actually vaudevillians in the Yiddish theater in Chicago. He grew up in that area, but of course made a successful crossover to Hollywood, becomes an Oscar-winning leading man. Molly Pecan, a huge star of the Yiddish stage, who had some small roles here and there in English language works, like The Naked City, where we see her for a few moments as a shopkeeper. And I should mention, when we're speaking of film, that there is a body of Yiddish film, and that's a really wonderful way to get to know a bit about Yiddish theater. So there's a beautiful film from Poland in the 1930s of the Dybbuk. It's actually a very late Yiddish film from, I think it's the late 40s, of God, Man, and Devil. It's a bit creaky, but with some nice performances. But if you go and look up someone like Molly Pecan, or just go and look up Yiddish film, the National Center for Jewish Film in Massachusetts has done, has remastered dozens of these, and so that's another really nice way into the field.
And it's interesting to hear you talk about some of these stars, such as Jacob Adler. And it's interesting. I think there's a tendency, perhaps, on many people's part to think about these figures in relation to quote unquote mainstream theater, i.e., English speaking in America's case. But many of these are huge stars in their own right.
That's right. And of course, performing in a minority language would have limited their reach in the so-called mainstream world. And many of them, certainly, the ones who are becoming big stars, as we see today, let's say, Spanish is not exactly a marginal language, right? But if you're becoming a huge, pop music star in Mexico, you may cast your eye north of the border and think, well, I've kind of hit a certain linguistic ceiling, and while I'm doing very well, if I can make it in the United States of America, then I really have pretty much all of the Americas in my world, and really it can be global. So in an even bigger way, the disparity between making it in Yiddish and being able to make it, let's say, on Broadway or later in Hollywood, would have been a huge lure. It was difficult for people like Adler and Tomaszewski and their generation. Um, for various reasons, their accents largely would have really limited them, and the kinds of roles, they could, they could really kind of be anybody on the Yiddish stage. They could be kings, they could be queens, they could be, they could be professionals, they could be criminals, whatever. And if they had a role in Hollywood, then it might likely be, a shopkeeper, a merchant, a rabbi, something like that. And indeed, we do see these people, some of these people pop up in those kinds of roles. It takes a little while before, say, we have people who are, if not born, at least raised in America, people sort of the generation of Paul Muni and later, who are equally fluid in English and a non-accent, or people like Joseph Bulow, who actually comes from Eastern Europe as a young man. He's already come of age. He's something of a name in the Yiddish-speaking world, but manages to get some significant roles on the English language stage. Some of that is a matter of timing. So he comes along at the right time to originate the role of Ali Hakim in Oklahoma. And so in Bulow's case, he's a remarkably gifted actor, and that accent kind of works. It does it now. He's not the leading man, but it's a great role. And he can find some roles like that. But that's partly why we don't know some of these people better. And I would say the other main reason that we don't, or at least one of the main reasons we don't, is that is by various accidents of history that kind of cut off the flow and the continuity of Yiddish theater. So throughout, the great era of emigration from Jewish emigration from Eastern Europe to the West, particularly to the United States, but significant numbers to various parts of Western Europe, to Canada, to Argentina, and elsewhere, is from the early 1880s to the 1920s. In 1881, Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, is assassinated. His son Alexander III takes over and rules with an iron fist and makes life in the Russian Empire much worse for many people, but perhaps for Jews more than most others. And many of them start looking for greener pastures elsewhere. So over the course of the next few decades, several million Jews leave Eastern Europe, and the lion's share of them end up in the United States. And so the Jewish populations of cities like New York and Philadelphia and Chicago grow astronomically. And that's really where the fledgling Yiddish theater that are really just, remember, begun to exist professionally in Eastern Europe. It's just a few years old. It's a baby at that point, still just sort of finding its way. But then there are people who are creating this material who come to America in the 1880s and the 1890s and beyond, and develop it to a much higher level. It also Yiddish theater gets banned in the Russian Empire not long after that. And so New York for some time really becomes the place to be for a Yiddish playwright or a Yiddish actor. Not the only place to be, and certainly there are others that are quite significant, like Warsaw, which and Poland develops a really thriving Yiddish theater in its own right. But particularly for the next few decades, America and particularly New York are the sort of center of gravity of Yiddish theater worldwide, and that continues to grow and blossom for several decades. 1920s bring a wave of xenophobia in the United States and new immigration laws that basically cut off the flow of new immigrants. So now we have a significant population that's not growing at the rate in terms of immigration in anything like the way that it had been. And the second and ultimately the third generations and beyond who had maybe came to America speaking Yiddish, had Yiddish speaking parents, they're now growing up in the world of the English language, and where and this is not an era of people proudly hyphenating their American and other identities. This is a time people to try to shed those other identities to a great extent. And so the younger people are coming up really moving away from Yiddish, again, not entirely, but to a great extent, and English is where they want to be. And so that's one of the factors that means that the it's there's just fewer people to pass the cultural baton to, um, after the flow of immigration gets cut off, and then on top of that, a generation later comes World War II and the Holocaust, the decimation of European Jewry. Again, the vast majority of Hitler's victims are Yiddish speakers. The center of the killing of European Jewry, the so-called bloodlands, in historian Timothy Snyder's words, is in Eastern Europe. It's in Poland. It's in the Soviet Union, and so we lose such a huge piece of that culture. And then those who survive, many of them who do make their way to the United States, it's just in so much smaller numbers than we had seen a generation before. And so the height of Yiddish theater really worldwide, with the main sort of centers of it being the United States and Eastern Europe, um, really was in the interwar period. And there's a lot more to be said about Yiddish theater and Yiddish culture and language post World War II, and that's another area that really has been overlooked in lots of ways, and there are sort of generalizations about it that are often wrong. But whatever happens after World War II is certainly, in terms of sheer quantity, not anything like we had seen before. And there are very few Yiddish films that come out after that. There are Yiddish theater companies, but there are far fewer of them, and the audience is much smaller. So those are some of the complicated factors why we don't know that world. And if history had taken some different turns, then we might see ongoing productivity. I think we would have been likely to. We would have seen a Yiddish film industry that was really just finding its feet in the 1930s, particularly in Poland, that was really thriving, with some in New York too, and elsewhere, and in the Soviet Union, that we just don't see that much of after the war.
It's interesting, too, that you mentioned in the late 40s, post World War II, there's this continuing Yiddish theater, other aspects of Yiddish culture. Uh, I sometimes feel a little awkward when I write or make social media posts about living figures.
Mm.
And calling what they're part of theater history, and I feel it's a little bit the same with the Yiddish theater in a way. It's still around. There are still artists producing work to this day. And I wonder if you might be able to talk about that.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate your sensitivity to it, because I think people often write in, and I mean that not only about your theater, but about theater history more generally, because I think we sometimes fall into this trap of sort of periodizations and sort of oversimplifications and cliches about this. Again, even people who are kind of oriented to that world, and I think there's certain kind of truisms develop about that. And so we think of, oh, okay, 1945 is kind of the end, and it's really not. So you have to acknowledge both. I mean, you can't say that Yiddish theater, culture, language weren't decimated by the Holocaust, but at the same time, it's important to know what was lost. It's important to know what continued. I've actually been researching recently plays by playwrights who were writing in response to the rise of Nazism, in response to the Holocaust, in response to the aftermath of the Holocaust. And interestingly, asking a lot of the same questions that in some ways we continue to ask about the Holocaust, as theological questions, historical questions, social questions, cultural questions. Um, there, we're in an interesting moment right now to come back to your question about what there is. And when you invited me to be on your podcast, it was a nice opportunity for me to do a bit of a survey of the kind of activity that's been happening recently. Um, I trained in a theater history program, theater program in New York at CUNY in the late 80s to the mid 1990s. And at the time, there were really a handful of people that I knew that had any really significant interest in this material from a scholarly perspective. And there were also, you found there were some Yiddish theater companies here and there, or there were Jewish theater companies that occasionally took an interest in Yiddish theater, but it was very kind of spotty. One of the nice things that's happened in the last couple of decades is that while in some ways it's still a very esoteric subject for academics, there's been a cadre of people uh, who've developed really around the world, who are working on various aspects of Yiddish theater and drama and performance from different angles. Sometimes from the theater angle, sometimes from the sort of general historians who take a particular interest in cultural productivity. There's some wonderful music scholars who have looked closely at Yiddish theater music. So what we've seen in the last couple of decades are I wouldn't say an explosion, but certainly relative to what there was, a proliferation of a handful of books, a lot more scholarly articles, some translations, some CD compilations of both sort of archival and new interpretations of Yiddish theater music. And very recently, there's been a kind of burst of activity. We'll see what kind of continuity there is with it, but in lots of ways, kind of ironically, we might think that with the passing of someone like Feivish Finkel, who in lots of ways have been racking my brains and thinking like, is there anyone else like that left? He really may be, in lots of ways, sadly, the last of the Mohicans. I don't know that I can count any other Mohicans around. He was 93 years old, and we've seen the passing of the various notable figures from the world of Yiddish theater from decades before, whether they were active recently, and Feivish Finkel was really active until the end, or whether their careers ended earlier. But we're seeing a revival of interest in various areas of Yiddish theater. Um, in scholarship, I'm the co-founder of a research group called the Digital Yiddish Theater Project. My partner in crime getting this off the ground is Deborah Kaplan, who teaches at Baruch College at CUNY. And we formed a research consortium of a group that now has 15 scholars, and some of us are also librarians and archivists, who are using digital tools, basically simply means computers, to preserve and study and teach about Yiddish theater. As it happens, we have a blog that's been around for about a year and a half now, that is about to migrate to a much more lovely website that will be that will be going live in late August. So people can simply go to that yiddishstage.org, and the blog is what we see as the beginning of a set of projects that will also eventually be up on the website. But right now, if people go to the blog, what they'll find is a a set of blog posts that tend to be, the sort of typical length of many blog posts, are short articles, often illustrated with video clips or music clips or still images, that tell the story of Yiddish theater and its connections to other areas of culture and language in a non-linear fashion. So it's really people weighing in, much like your blog does, Mike, of weighing in on just different areas of interest. The difference is that this is a group of people, and we also have guest posts, and so we look at Yiddish theater in different times and places. We look at it around the world. And, again, I would recommend, like, Namasandro is the nice linear way in if you want to get the story with a kind of beginning, middle, and not an end, but, coming up to recent times. And the Digital Yiddish Theater Project is a way to sort of bounce around in the field. Another way that people have learned about Yiddish theater very recently is you and I corresponded about a lovely exhibit that was at the Museum of the City of New York. Sadly, unless it was extended recently, I didn't hear about it. It just closed. But a beautiful exhibit curated by Edna Nachshon, who's a very fine scholar of Yiddish theater and other areas of Jewish theater and Jewish culture. And that told the story of Yiddish theater in America. Good news, well, two bits of good news about that exhibition. One is that the Museum of the City of New York has a wonderful website where people can explore many hundreds of photographs of actors and productions and things. And Edna Nachshon also edited a book that helps tell the story that is connected with that exhibition. On stage, there have been a couple of significant productions recently, and I should mention that New York isn't the only place where these things happen, and there's activity in Montreal and in Tel Aviv and in different places in Europe and elsewhere. But sticking with the American context, the past season saw a really interesting thing happen, that there were two different Yiddish language productions in New York that each were nominated for two Drama Desk awards. One of them was a revival of a Yiddish translation of Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. I mentioned Joseph Buloff before. He's actually the person who made the translation and who starred as Willy Loman in it in the 1950s. It was recently revived by a company called the New Yiddish Rep and starred Abby Hoffman as Willy Loman. And Hoffman was nominated as well as the production itself for awards. I believe that's coming back to New York this fall. So people should look for that. And running right now downtown in Battery Park in New York City, and it's going to be running for, I believe, the next few months, is a musical called The Golden Akala, The Golden Bride. This was a hit on the Yiddish stage in New York in the 1920s. And thanks to the really diligent, long-term research of a musicologist named Michael Ox, Michael found different pieces of the score in many different places, and it was brought together by the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene. I had the pleasure of seeing the Golden Bride earlier this summer, and it is absolutely delightful. It is performed at a very high level by talented actors, singers, musicians, and is really a treat. So if people have a chance to see it, they absolutely should go. And it gives a really nice flavor of what these musicals might have been like. You mentioned before, Mike, that how people don't tend to know what these things were like. Even those of us who study Yiddish theater, there have been so few opportunities to experience something like The Golden Bride live. We could spend all day, every day, reading the text of these plays. Of course, theater people understand that reading the text of the play is not the same as seeing it, even more so with a musical. And even if you manage very diligently to, let's say, find the text of a play like The Golden Bride or any of the hundreds of other musicals that were done in that era, And even if you can then, let's say, go to a sound archive or find recordings of plays, to bring all of that together and to actually see it on stage done well is a rare treat, even for theater historians who work on Yiddish theater. So, and I happened to go to that with a number of Yiddish theater historians, and we all turned to each other after and said, it was so illuminating, as well, just a pleasure on various other levels. But in our very geeky way, it was so illuminating to really to see this, and many of us had the feeling that the Golden Bride has its own special pleasures and delights, but it must have been so typical of so many other things that were done. And the man who wrote the score was a man named Joseph Rumshinsky, who was a very prolific composer for the Yiddish stage, and he was a real virtuoso. And the music ranges over. There's a kind of anthem to the new Soviet Union, because this premiered in 1923, at a time when people could be a bit starry-eyed about the Soviet Union, without Stalin being the person who's presiding over the thing yet. And at the same time, there's songs about American life and culture and baseball and things like that. So it really just sort of all over the place in really lovely ways. So those are some of the things that have been happening at the moment. There's really life in this field yet, and I've been talking to some of the people like Motel Didner at the Volksbühne, who's a very talented director and translator, and a real student of Yiddish theater and its history. And he's planning various very interesting productions and stage readings and things. Not only he, of course, he and his colleagues there. So I think there are some people around now in the field, either established or kind of coming up, who are doing and are going to be doing some really interesting things. And we all, whether we're specialists or just interested in theater generally, I think going to have new opportunities to get to know Yiddish theater in ways that people haven't for quite a long time.
Well, that's a really encouraging note to end on. Well, wonderful. We'll have links in the show notes to things like the Digital Yiddish Theater Project, so that listeners can go check those out, learn more about it. Joel, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you again for having me. I'm really appreciate your interest and hope that people enjoy getting to know Yiddish theater better.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please go to howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our music this week is from the recent National Yiddish Theater Volksbühne production of The Golden Bride. It was arranged and orchestrated by Zalman Mlotek, and it comes to us courtesy of the NYTF. Thanks to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And, as always, thank you for listening.